Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery, and I'm excited to have Brandon Kleinman, who's the founder of Birthday App, a fintech app that allows consumers to track, send, and receive birthday wishes and gifts at the click of a button. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Hi, so happy to be here. This is going to be real fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been into a couple of startups, but how did you get your journey started in this crazy world of startups?
I mean, I'd be lying to say it didn't, somewhat pick me. I have this old joke where, back when I was a kid, I, like a lot of founders, I ended up being a, more difficult child. And you get this moment when you're young where whether it's bad grades or getting in trouble a lot, you have to decide, and it's all subconscious, I think, whether or not they're right in that your skills are not good and or you believe that you're different and that it doesn't make sense to listen to them when they tell you don't have it. And so I've been an entrepreneur literally, whether it was selling baseball cards or selling answers to the tests before they came because I knew how to get them. I've always been that. But my official journey probably happened. Um, I had an idea when I was working in a job, and I convinced the CTO of the company that it was a good idea. And we worked from 9 p.m. to about 1 a.m. every night. And our rule was if we could get a demo up in 60 days, we would leave the job and go start and raise money. And we did. And my first company was called What's Good. It did not work. And then, ironically, everything after that seemed to work. But I don't think any of my success with those other companies would have worked had I not just, the first one was you just learned kind of how it all works. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, interesting. I've heard about Lauren and Wolf because you were able to scale it to $150 million. You raised $25 million from tier one funds, and then Vesta Home also, which was led by 8VC. So yeah, what was the experience? Building to totally different startups.
well, um, it was wild. They're both in their way multifaceted marketplace businesses, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have much experience with either with design that when I first started learning Wolf. By the time I got to Vesta Home, which is a home staging business, I obviously
Right.
had experience, and so it's more straightforward than it seems. I remember, the first thing we had to do before we raised money was we had to generate demand, right? Enough demand not only to validate our idea, but we want
Right.
to raise money. We wanted to validate to the investors this thing they should back. And I remember the first thing we did, which was super clever, I think, was this was in the age of early Facebook. We built easily the first one. We called it a style quiz, where we showed you 12 pictures of interiors and you said yes or no. And by the end, we give you a score to tell you what your design style was. And in order to get the answer at the end, you'd have to give us your email and opt into Laura Wolf. And I think we got something like in 48 hours, we got something like 6,000 signups for this. And granted, Facebook ads were, basically free back then. But we built this thing that was, would go on to be kind of like a BuzzFeed style culture, which was give people a little thing about themselves. But it was off to the races. And so the first thing was just proving demand and kind of catching our customer base where they were. I'd say the same thing kind of happened with Vesta was when we started doing it, it was very clear that the staging relationships were owned by real estate brokers because most people didn't buy or own houses more than once or twice a decade. They didn't
Right.
care who staged their house, they didn't know anything about it. But the real estate brokers were doing it multiple times a week in some cases. And so you go to the person, the decision maker. And so we built our whole business around supporting real estate brokers early on, which allowed us to catch a lot of the marketplace. And there were some other real clever kind of activities we did with that in order to really try to capture the market on that. But it's this idea of you figure out who is the person deciding, not even buying, who's deciding how money is spent on your thing, and then finding a way to get their attention. It's almost never selling directly. It's almost always, yeah, some version of figuring out, what they do in their daily life and like
Right.
what they will opt into personally.
Hmm. Got it. And what made you start about the app? What it's something which is very different from what you've done before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a little bit of a crazy person in that I love to do stuff that's like new and difficult. I think I probably would have benefited from, playing the game a little bit on easier mode. But you asked kind of the question of what I did when I first started the companies. But there's like this funny thing that happens for entrepreneurs that like have done it a few times,
Right.
which is you start with idea on your first one, and then you start with distribution on everyone afterwards. Like you kind of
Yeah.
learn that like it doesn't really matter how clever your idea is. Everything kind of is how fast you can get this thing in people's hands. And
Right.
so one of the things that I have this theory on is this idea of like repeating moments. There's the opening up an app every morning. It's almost like ceremony. Like, when you in your bed, when you wake up, there's a ceremony with your phone. You look at all, whether it's Instagram, maybe you look at like The Athletic, if you're reading sports out here, the New York Times crossword puzzle. Everybody has a ceremony they do, right? And from a purchasing perspective, you have these holidays, Christmas, Black Friday, New Year's, which are enormous moments for connecting with friends, buying things. And I was doing the research. Also, I had built some fun side projects, and birthdays were bigger than all these holidays. They were just fractured, right? And I'm sure you remember back in the day with Facebook, you'd see everyone's birthday, you wish them a happy birthday. And so my belief was, well, if I could find a way that wasn't kind of didn't feel gross to go and find all your birthdays, put them in a single place, not
Right.
force anything on you other than a reminder that these people's birthdays are coming up, then I'd build this channel from scratch. And we did it. And holy shit, did people use it? Like even more than we thought originally. And it was off to the races. It's this instead of looking for distribution for an idea, this idea was an idea strictly about distribution, I think. And
Mm.
I'm also a huge birthday person. And I know how special and important it can be. And it just felt like something that, they always say that I would use. And I do use it every morning. And so, yeah.
Nice. Got it. Yeah, no, absolutely. But because I've been into business development and sales, I think this is something which is very useful for revenue leaders as well. Yeah. And is it US only for now, or have you rolled it out across?
It's only US for now. Some of the ways that we find the birthdays are a little bit more difficult as we get into new country codes. There's like a whole model basically that matches kind of phone numbers sometimes and names sometimes and a bunch of other stuff on your phone sometimes. And so we expect to expand, but currently we're only the US.
Okay, got it. And you also use a very sophisticated AI generated tool to scrape out all the records. How do you use the technology to gather all the information?
It wasn't called AI when we built it, but I guess it is now. I would say that, or what it is, it's just straight up, is there's a lot of public data on the internet. We didn't buy anything like secret or anything like that, but we have an amazing team of engineers that were essentially able to take all of this messy data that they're collecting kind of secretly about you and putting on the internet, clean it up and serve it back in a way that you can use it. One of the other things was, I remember I always find data on me on the internet, and our take was if we can offer something, as long as it stayed free, if we can offer something free that kind of takes the stuff that already exists on you and allows you to get value from it, um, we're not saving the world, but like I feel like you're owed it. And so that's kind of how we did it. There are some tricks that we found just by mostly psychological things, like what signal how close somebody is to you, but it's mostly using public data and then building this kind of confidence machine.
Mm. Got it. And you mentioned about reminders. Yeah, I was just wondering, what sort of gift options can people access through birthday app, and how does it make it easier to
Yep.
gift? Yeah.
So coming up, we have we're relaunching our gift store. It
Right.
is going to include flowers, chocolates,
Nice.
last second experiences. But the whole thing here is that most people plan. We actually did the largest survey on how people think about birthdays, I think ever, which
Right.
you'll see coming out in the news. But most people, something like I want to say 80% of birthdays are planned for the week of. And so sometimes it can be very difficult to get a gift in time. And so we try to hack that process where we know that you're going to be showing up, and we make it so you don't kind of end up having to do something that doesn't seem very thoughtful. And so it'll cover food experiences, some really cool CPG products for partners. But yeah, and it's one of those things where it's a living store where, depending on kind of what people are demanding, we can kind of figure it out. But there's a good chance you go buy, you can buy elsewhere as well. But we try to just make it as easy as possible to kind of be thoughtful. There should be a scheduling feature as well. So at some point you can say, these people I have to get gifts for, and we make sure you do not miss that day with the gifts.
Okay, got it. And yeah, many people still rely on Facebook and calendar sync, but how do you gather all that birthday information? Yeah, and what if Facebook stops you from gathering all that information? Is that
We're not relying on any of those companies. Like, our model is pretty self-driven as far as things go, so we're protected. That was like the whole thing of the company was, can we build, what's the old joke? It's like using a sledgehammer to hang a picture. Like, I don't want to use Facebook to remember a birthday. Like, there's so much stuff there that like I don't want, that I don't need it. So we're here to solve singular problem, which is this birthday and showing up for your friends problem. And we believe that there is a monster place for all of these, for both people, but also these amazing companies that have built products everybody wants. That, one of the funny things that you'll see on the survey is that the number one way people decide where to give people, like for gifts, tends to be the exposure effect, in that whatever they saw in the last 2 weeks ends up being kind of like the small universe of what they pick from. And which sucks, because it's one of these things where like there's perfect gifts for people out there, but it's just impossible to figure out when is the right time to approach them, especially when it comes to birthdays and kind of personal events. And so we're doing this so these products find the audience that actually wants them just at the right time. That stuff matters. The coordination problem is huge.
Got it. And I was just wondering, is the distribution approach more B2B focused, like partnering up with companies for employee rewards and recognition, but and how did you get your first 1,000 users? You mentioned you got it all organically, but how did you manage to do it?
Yeah. So to the first question, what we see a lot of real estate professionals as well as finance, kind of money management professionals use this on their own phone to reach out to their customer base. We don't have a B2B integration yet, but you can use it for that. And then, from the perspective of how do we get our first users, it just started with friends, and then it grew. And then there were a couple organic TikToks that our user base put out that got us a lot of users. We get mentioned in lists all the time too. And yeah, so far that we have some ideas for some pretty targeted semi-organic. I think we'll get coverage some places for some really, for some stories that I think are going to come out. But yeah, and there is just, people send, I don't know if you've seen the app lately, I assume you have, obviously, but you can send cards where like, I can take my face, put it on like a really ridiculous card that says like, happy birthday, let's catch up. And it's my face on a hot dog. And so you find that people send these cards and they're watermarked birthday app, and people come back. And so there is a little bit of endemic product growth.
Got it. Super interesting. And what's the revenue model like? Do you take fees on the gifts or from the brands?
Take fees on the gifts, as well as we have some partners that we're going to be doing some additional kind of things or pieces with, and then there will end up being an advertising component to the business that, like, we have all these amazing reminders. I think the average user basically opts in by choice. Like, they pick out, I'm trying to do the math in my head, 42. They opt into about 50 reminder emails for different birthdays. Not 50 people. It's about 14 or 15 people, but 50 different times. Like, remind me in 2 weeks, remind me in 1 week. And that real estate, that like Rohit's birthday is coming up in 2 weeks, and then you can
Yeah.
throw flowers there with one click. You can schedule a delivery. That real estate is preemptively crazy for these brands. And so we're rolling out a feature that essentially is going to pair these in the future reminder dates with these products that should, from testing, have pretty ridiculous conversion rates.
Got it. Got it. And yeah, especially since you've built, a couple of startups, and we have a lot of founders who, in the early stage, who are listening to this show. What's the single biggest mistakes founders make when they're trying to find a product market fit?
So there was this great, I'm going to use like something that I saw that I really liked, but to kind of back into a bigger point. But like, I think there's a guy who did Zenefits and is now doing Conrad Parker, I think his name
Yeah,
is, I want
Conor
to
Park.
say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. He had this, he was talking about fundraising, and
Right.
and he said something along the lines of, obviously it's important, but a lot of the time founders raise money like as they go, because you feel like an insane person showing up at your friends' houses and your family events, and maybe 18 months or 12 months have passed and your business has changed a lot internally, but not really externally. And so you need this thing to explain to people that you're making progress. And a fundraising round is a really good way to explain that the business has grown or progressed, but a lot of it is for you to feel less like, a loser or something when you're talking to everybody who has no idea what you're doing. And so I think in general, it's really easy, whether you're hiring too fast, whether you try to go raise money too quickly, whether you build a bunch of features, it's really easy to get caught up in feeling awkward about that. Sometimes this takes time, and sometimes the growth is really lumpy, where it's like, it'll feel like nothing's happening for 9 months and then everything will happen. And so I think it's never going to go away, the feeling of social pressure of like having to explain to people you're building your own business. But I think it's getting in touch with like what things are pushing you to make decisions, because you feel, this is the most intellectually violent sport I can think of. Like, you're building this thing in a room that nobody understands, and you're having to explain it, and you're having to explain like how it's grown. And so really getting in touch with how you feel about where you're in the company and how that affects your decisions is a really, really big one. Also, another fun one, because I imagine everybody's thinking about raising money, is I always like the adage, if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. A lot of kids roll in or people roll in and they're like, we need this much money for this. And I find, unless you already know this person and they would back you kind of through anything, that it's a weird negative social signal. It's kind of like dating, you want to have your intentions, but if you state them overtly, there's something that's not socially as acceptable there. And so you have to get really good, I think, at pushing for what you want without asking for it in the beginning. I have a bunch of things. But yeah, those are the two that come to mind, is just like really understand what you're insecure about, what you're building the business, and just make sure that it's not driving decisions. And then the other one is that like most of this is like a social dance. And so don't think, especially when it comes to fundraising, don't think about it's not a pursuit, like a logic pursuit. Nobody's giving you money for completely logical reasons. Every one of these people, most of these people, are either managing somebody else's money, or they're managing their own, but they have an interesting relationship with it. And so understand it on kind of the emotional level when you go and do it. And don't, it's really dangerous to like think about people making decisions based on logic. It almost never, ever, ever is the reason anybody makes decisions. I think it's for everything, but for fundraising especially.
Got it. And what's your biggest piece of advice to founders when they're trying to find the core target audience and customer discovery the right way, especially because founders want to target a lot of ICPs?
So this is kind of the thing. I feel like people don't talk about it as much. This kind of goes to the feeling like shit where you build your company too. A lot of the biggest stories that Airbnbs, Facebook, it reads as if they did some type of like magical like target customer building and they knew it and they went into it. What mostly normally happens is they do stuff and then something works that's not exactly that same idea. And then it takes them a pretty good amount of time to really understand why people like their product. Like it's growing. You'd be surprised how many of these giant growing companies have no fucking clue, excuse my language, like why it's growing or some type of like 70% understanding, because it's so complicated. Like you can see the numbers, but the numbers tend to not always do the full kind of reasoning unless you're in a very straightforward SaaS business. Like they tend to not always tell the whole story. And so what I'm getting at here is you just have to try stuff and talk to your customers and keep trying. The numbers will kind of tell you what's working, but don't be fooled into feeling bad about yourself if you don't fully understand why things work and why things don't work. Most of the big stories, are historical revisionisms where like way later they told the story as if, oh, we had this happen, A happened, then B happened, and then it was obviously C. It is almost never that. It's, they find C 2 years later when they're telling the story on stage. But I would say there's quite literally no substitute for just going out there, talking to customers, getting your butt kicked, and also just trying. One of the things that kind of gets in people's ways, I think, is you have this idea how the world works and you stick to your own logic. And it's tough because, you think like everything has been earned by experience, so it has to be right. But like, I've been on projects before where it's completely irrational at like why people, my brother is also an entrepreneur in the kind of sports card space. He's got a great company. It's called Rare One. You can check it out, rare1.app, but it's basically, it lists where all the most valuable cards are currently in the world. Like if they've come out of packs already or they haven't.
Yes.
And it's one of these things where the logical stuff, like it worked. People really like to track their cards, but some of the community stuff, just like hanging around in a chat room or whatever it is, tended to have the biggest lift on growing the audience. And even to this day, like you can kind of explain like why people like to do it. There's the obvious stuff like, oh, they're just looking for a community and like these are their friends, but like it's not clear how you scale that. Like, and so the answer is just try stuff. Like if anybody tells you they have some type of framework to really get to it, they're probably trying to sell you something. And the one thing that I have seen that is helpful is there's a book called The Mom Test. I don't know if you've read it before. And so most people either don't care to like understand for good reason, everyone's busy, or most abstraction is actually just bad decision and bad product. And so for the most part, unless it's a very technical thing, and even then, you can kind of figure out explaining what you do to somebody. If they can't understand it pretty quickly, you're probably doing too much. And so, I've always tried to do that. Like this was really hard with Birthday App. Our big, amazing magic miracle is that we know all the birthdays that you don't know. And it sounds very simple the way I just said it there, but you'd be shocked. I even have investors on the cap table, I think, that believed it was a birthday app for storing birthdays that you knew. But it was so bizarre that we knew everybody's birthday when you opened up the app already that people didn't even perceive it as like that the app could possibly do it. And so as many times as I would explain it, they would just assume like it was, they were pulling from Facebook or they were pulling from like your iPhone. And as many times as I explained it, it didn't hit with everybody. And so just working on, I always say that like when you have a conversation with this investor or a friend or a customer, they're going to remember one bullet point, maybe 2 bullet points. And so figure out what is the sentence that you want them to walk away from. And bonus points, you can give them a sentence that's so exciting that they have to share it like it's a secret, but you're only going to get one sentence. So if you have to sit there and give them 2 or 3 things to remember, you're probably already screwed.
Got it. And Brandon, you've been into a couple of startups, but and quite successful ones. But does your identity tie up with with your previous startups and the success of the company?
Hell yes.
Yeah.
It's one of these things like everything. the grass is not always greener. It's nice that, you know, I have a good story about myself now, in
Right.
that I've had some successful startups, and I've learned some things via the successful startups, but every single time is like extremely violent and extremely hard. I would say one of the downsides of having successes is you tend to not, you know, when I did Laurel and Wolf, man, every time we got press, every time we recruited somebody into the company, I was going home like to my girlfriend with like the biggest smile. And I was good. I was good for 48 hours or whatever, 72 hours. But as like the bar for what is considered a success starts to, you kind of get the worst of both worlds sometimes, in that you don't really kind of credit, you don't give yourself a lot of leeway for the stuff that is hard, but you've already done before. And so you're kind of fighting these larger expectations, even though it's the same work. I don't get, maybe I have more contacts when fundraising or doing sales, or understand how to do less. You know, it's the old joke. You don't actually have to be really good at any of this stuff. You just have to not do stupid things.
Right.
Like if you just if you just don't do stuff that kills you, like you'll probably win over the course of a long period of time. And
Right.
so I've gotten better at some of those things just because I've done so many bad things or stupid things historically. But, you know, as hard as it for somebody trying to get attention as a new startup, you know, and it's not necessarily commiserate, but the other side, when you start to do, when you had success and your company is growing, but not growing to like something that was bigger than we did before, there's, you know, it can be very tough emotionally, or it can be hard reflectively when you start to have that. So it's always hard. There is no, if it was easy, you wouldn't make as much money, number one. And two, like, have a whole lot of people doing it.
Hmm. And 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 how do you keep score of, how you're doing? What does success really mean for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I got a big birthday coming up, and I think about that, or have been thinking about that quite a bit. But I think it depends. Um, you know, when I was in my first company, I was in my I think in my late 20s, and it was about the money, like making as much money as possible. I loved the press. I loved all of that stuff. And the second company, it was about the team. It was about the product. It was about building like the right type of organization, one that I wanted to be a part of, and that worked and grew and was, you know, like the energy was right in building it. And on the third one, it was trying something different and seeing how, if what kind of transferred over. And so from a scorecard perspective, I don't really have a great answer to it. I think it'll change with what you want from your life. I think, I guess this is like a little bit of a tangent, but one thing I will say, this is not a particularly popular thing in the days of, you know, mental health and stuff like that. I believe it's unreasonable wanting to do this kind of stuff. You know, I don't know that everybody's trying to fill a hole, but like sticking with this stuff, I think over a long period of time is some motivation inside of all of us that's unreasonable. It's to prove somebody wrong. It's to, you know, not have a situation maybe that you grew up in, that like whether it's financial or whether it's, you know, professional, and you really need that kind of stuff to get through this, because the act of doing it is unreasonable. There are plenty of ways, you know, once you build some skill sets, to go out and have a life, a balanced life. And so you hear these guys, big VCs, talking about having to work late and stuff. I think it's less about the specifics of like working super hard. I just think you have to have an unreasonable reason to do this. And so it's why you don't have to have like terrible mental health to do this kind of stuff. Like it's not a complete trade-off. But I do believe you have to understand that if you're going to be in this, the fact that you chose yourself to do this means that you're trying to accomplish something that like is probably unbalanced in like how you spend your time. And I think understanding that, and knowing that it's probably going to be slightly unhealthy, is, I just never seen somebody build something big without an unreasonable drive to do so. And so it's not a direct answer to your scorecard question, but I think that's a superpower. I think it's
Mm,
like, this is an endurance sport. Like
yeah.
being clever is nice, but the ones that win are basically the ones that stay alive long enough to kind of figure out something, get a little bit lucky, and then don't fuck up doing that one thing until you have a resolution.
Got it. And especially in 2023, it's been a tough year, but what do you think
Mhm.
would be, some of the outcomes available for companies?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It's a wide stretch. I'm sorry if I'm getting too philosophical here. I think a lot about like what it takes to kind of build these things and why I love it and why some of my friends love it. And so, but I think it's important because I think that from outcome perspective, I can't predict the future. If I did, I'd, have statues. Um, but I think that it's pretty straightforward what's going to happen next. You know, it's if you follow the money, it's that interest rates are much higher all across the world.
Yeah.
And so it's going to mean less money in startups because people can just park their money and make guaranteed interest rates. Startups will always be sexy. People never talk about this, but like if you've got money, it's from like a social capital. It's just exciting. It's an exciting place to invest, and it will almost always be a little bit of that. And so I think startups will always be overrepresented as like money comes in than it probably should be. Like if you're looking at it kind of from a return basis, but it's going to be a little bit harder to do that, which means that companies are going to have to get to revenue quicker, like everybody talks about. They're probably going to have to think about valuations a little bit differently. And I think you're going to see, a lot of these big businesses. If you look at Uber, if you look at like even smaller ones that like, our friend Conrad, we were talking about before, Zenefits and stuff like that. They had a pretty specific playbook. They basically went into a market. They got a lot of money so they could change how the pricing worked temporarily and made it impossible for responsible kind of economic businesses to exist. And then eventually the money dried up and then they raised their prices back to what everybody else was mostly charging. But at that point, they had a market. And sometimes the investors, they were the ones who had to pay for
Mhm.
that. And sometimes the market had to pay for it. And then sometimes both sides did or didn't. But I think what you're going to see is it's just going to be a little less crazy in the sense that, like, don't get me wrong, there will always be crazy money that exists for you. If you have a good enough idea, you can tell a good enough story. But I think you're just looking at, like, you just have to kind of build a little bit more of a logically sensible business. Or maybe that's not it. You need a better story. You still will be able to do those big subsidy businesses. It's just going to be harder because I think there's less money. You're competing. Like all the people that were backing the companies in 2018 are now diversified elsewhere as well. So you have to convince them essentially, or the chain that, yeah, I hope I'm not being too abstract. This is like way high level. I feel like heady, you know, I don't know. It's not smart. I feel like I can be more specific. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, a couple of outcomes for companies could be, they would need to sell off the company. I mean, lot of firing is happening, but especially, lot of companies do go under when the co-founders fight. And what's your advice to founders when it comes to, selecting a co-founder?
Woo. I've been in good co-founder relationships. I've been in less good co-founder relationships. Um, it's funny. If I knew this, I would definitely go and be a marriage counselor more than I'd be a co-founder counselor because it's about the same. But I think that the one thing that has been consistent is there should be as little skill or responsibility overlap as possible. What ends up happening if you have a lot of responsibility overlap is you get resentment, whether it's somebody doing the thing that you should feel like should be your responsibility, or worse, one person starts to take more of the stuff and feels like the other person. There's also this weird thing where, when you have two people who have very different responsibilities, they also don't really understand as much what the other person does on a day-to-day basis, which the way that like the human mind works, I think makes it so if you don't understand it, you can't reflect on it and you can't be mad at it. And so,
Mm.
if you have a technical co-founder and a sales co-founder, they don't really sit and be like, well, shit, I wish that he was better on that call because of XYZ. And so if you don't kind of reflect on it, like I said, you don't build resentment for them not doing as good a job. You still need to see results. And so when you don't have overlap, I think you don't evaluate each other as hard because both sides are unfamiliar to each other. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah.
And so that would be one of them. And then also, you should more or less know what outcome you're both looking for,
Yeah.
but that's really hard because companies change and companies change people as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
You'd be amazed at how like somebody's ambition changes when a company takes off versus what they started off with. You get all the stories like the Airbnb founders where like they were literally just trying to rent out these rooms to start, and
Yeah.
then like become this big public company, and like it changes you. And so I think it's really hard. And then this is now more of like a relationship one that I get in my own life. But you should understand, and this goes if you're in a marriage or dating somebody, figure out how they fight.
Mm.
Like when they're upset, are they yellers? Are they passive aggressive? And I think just having an honest take about how they communicate when things aren't going well will likely save you a lot of time and misunderstanding. And so those be my two. Figure out how they communicate when things aren't going as they had hoped, and then also try to get as little overlap as possible on what your responsibilities and skill sets are within the business.
Got it. And just to follow up on that, do you think before you start a project, should you talk about what values aligns, and what is the goal that you're looking for? Does it make sense, or it's more about?
It's funny, like it's one of these things that's really hard in that, like, I don't know, if I asked you what you loved about what makes a great relationship to you, and then I showed you the footage of the last 10 years of your life, my guess is it wouldn't always match up. And so I think it's really hard to you should ask people because it's always important, especially for like starting to build a place where like you guys can talk to each other. But I think in general people have what they want to be from a values and outcome, and then how they act. And often there's a bit of a disconnect, and not by any fault of anybody's. It's just really hard to evaluate yourself, I think. And sometimes if somebody says they're one thing and acts the other way, and they truly believe that, it creates even more animosity because it feels like you are misled, even though no party was trying to mislead the other. I think that the only way to really do this, and it's kind of the same as finding customers in a startup, is it's why it's really hard to find a co-founder when you just met them, is like
Mm.
time. Time is the number one indicator on what somebody is, and even better if it's time plus difficult things and being really close to each other. And just pay attention. Everybody tells you via action, whether it's a partner, a romantic partner, a customer, they tell you what they are. You just you choose to listen and actually take them at face value, or you choose to like we were talking about before, kind of rationalize, well, this was because of this, but like people, yeah. That's a long answer, but time and just getting dirty with people is the best way to figure out
Mm.
what it
Mm.
is. And if they're a dick up front, excuse my language, or if they're dishonest up front, you can almost guarantee that like that is more or less what you can expect to see moving forward.
Yeah. And Brandon, you raised a lot of money in your previous startups. What's the biggest piece of VC advice to founders that you find is not correct, or you find it to be wrong?
I got a bunch. People think about funds as organizations, like,
Right.
oh, they like this type of thing.
Right.
Most decisions within a fund are made by a small group of people, and they're made individually, and
Mm.
they tend to be reflective of that person's personality, what's going on in their life, what's in the news cycle. And so thinking about every investor you talk to as an individual with individual motivations and individual distractions and individual goals is a big one. Firms don't exist, even though they want you to say they do. They do not. Everybody has. There's like an old joke in SaaS. I saw it on Twitter, and I think it works for investment too. All products should be built to either make sure somebody doesn't get fired or to get somebody promoted. And I think that it works for the same thing for investors. Especially as you get closer to early stage, I think that it's so hard to determine what's going to work.
Right.
What you're really trying to do is, an investor's job when they go into a meeting with you is they are looking for every reason to say no specifically, because if they looked for reasons to say yes, they'd have no money left over and it wouldn't work. And so they are actively, and it's smart, looking to disqualify you. And so your job is to, not get disqualified over time with them. I'm trying to think what else. Those are some good ones. Very few investors will invest without a relationship. No, that's not true. Let me take that back. Most investors, which everybody knows, will invest when other people are investing. It is very, very hard. And so people go out there and they do this thing where they're trying to get around together. But really what ends up happening is you find, I know what I can talk about too. I'll give you one more after this one, is your goal as a company. And everybody's different. You don't have to be this charismatic. I know I'm pretty high energy. You can probably guess, but there's introverts, there are numbers people, but your goal is to get somebody so excited about what you're doing that they text their friends, that their investor friends, that I found this thing, and their way to brag is to say, you should check this out. And so you should be thinking about, especially early stage, the emotions you create, and not, your business is not a business at that point. It's an idea. Even when you get to the A and the B, you're still selling this idea of potential. And so people fall into this trap of you need this much revenue, need that. In some spaces, it is, there are benchmarks that really kind of dictate, pricing and stuff like that. But it's an emotional pitch. You are not building a business and raising money are two pretty different skill sets. And so your job is to get one person emotionally excited about you or your space or your growth. And you pick one thing. You don't want to convince people of three things at once. There's almost always one thing that gets them hot. And then they bring in their friends. And if you're trying to get in a competitive round, once you get one person excited or nervous or whatever, and you tell all the people in their social group, you'll start to see that you don't actually have to convince anybody. And so think about this process. This goes back to the first thing I said, is that you're pitching an individual with their own individual stresses and goals and hangups. And your job is to quickly understand what those things are and get them emotionally invested in what you're doing. If you can figure that out, you'll never have trouble raising money in any market anywhere.
Got it. Super interesting. And I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
The first one that comes to mind is an old school short book. It's called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. I think it's Trout and Reese. Do you know it?
Yeah, I've heard.
And so it's a book on positioning, but I think it's something more. I think it is underappreciated. It's this idea that, I'm gonna get a little bit abstract here again, so stop me. But it's this idea that every decision people make is relative, right? There's my favorite was, I think it was Budget, when Avis or Hertz was the big rental car company, and they were just in second place, right? They could not figure out anything. It was like a mad scramble for the second. They created an ad campaign, which was, we're second, but we try harder, right? And it was this honest take. They weren't trying to front. They're kind of the Pepsi to the Coke, right? And I think this understanding that the way everybody processes information is relative to what they already know, not only can help you position a business or a fundraise round, but if you really think through how you're communicating to people, whether you're recruiting, whether you're raising money, whether you're trying to talk to customers, it starts to make you understand where's their head now, how would they perceive us in addition to, or relative to the truth they have right now. And so I go back to that book probably 2 or 3 times a year. It's got so many marks in it that like it's probably hard to read some of the pages. But that's the one that comes to mind. There are a bunch of really good ones though.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes. And if you could go back in time when you started about the app, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
I'm gonna say this for all apps because it doesn't only apply to birthday app. There's obviously you get Paul Graham saying build something that people want. And I think that's right. It's never that easy because often you don't get a large enough audience to even test the thing, if that makes sense. And so sometimes it's hard to even tell if it's something somebody wants because you don't even get the attention to do it. But if you're going to build something, and this is build it in a place where people are spending money. It's really, really, really hard to build a product that isn't part of some type of exchange of cash, right? That goes for consumer, but it's also SaaS. Like if they're spending a ton of money on hosting, or they're spending a ton of money on invoicing, right?
Yeah.
Build something that can be looped in to the same budget line item as that thing that's already being spent. Because what you end up doing if you don't do that is you have to building two companies. You have to build an actual product, and then you have to build essentially a demand for, or like you have to build a process in which people spend money on something they never did before. And so build close to an existing ocean of money. Don't try to invent one. It's very expensive and very difficult.
Got it. And do you have any favorite online tool, for example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
Ooh, I want less all of those things. But this one's more of a personal preference. I've gotten into the habit of doing phone calls instead of, I'll tell you what I would say? This is a good counterintuitive one, and it's very difficult in the world we're in now. If you get an opportunity, whether it's fundraising or recruiting or a business partner, do everything you can, everything to meet them in person.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that has become really difficult with Slack and Zoom and phone calls is it's like one of these things. You have an online friend, you meet him in person, and like you learn more in 45 minutes than you did in 5 years, because there's all these tiny signals that people send to each other when they're in person: approval, disapproval, like what they don't like what type of personality they are, that like you will get more from being in person with somebody than you will in all the other ones combined. And so I'd even take it as far as like, it's a good book. You guys, have you read the Sam Walton biography?
Yeah, I love it.
And so, yeah, he talks about every time they interview somebody who worked with him, they're like, that boy was crazy. He'd be on a honeymoon or his vacation. He'd stop at the store and talk to the manager, and he'd walk the floor. And like everybody said that he would fly out to people. And I think the only way to get enough information about somebody's experience that like you might be able to actually internalize it is to see them tell it and figure out where like it was important and where it wasn't. So fight for more in-person meetings. It could change your life. Also, it's an easier way to make personal relationships with people, I think, that can last a lot longer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just wanted to want to understand what's the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Birthday app.
Yeah, I'm Brandon at birthday.app, or I'm on Twitter at BKSenior. And yeah, I'm pretty responsive. Like I'm out there, and let's see, what do we need? We are now building our gift store, and we are looking for partner brands to go in there. We're only gonna offer 1 or 2 per category. And so it's gonna be a small gift store. We believe that less is more with this kind of stuff. And we obviously have a very, very high kind of conversion experience for people. And so we have some great kind of brands now, but we're always looking for more. And we have potentially an experiment going called Magic Button, which will allow our birthday calendar to live in partners' apps, and will create the same relationship and experience within their own app. We have a couple people who have asked us to do it. We haven't chosen who we're going to launch it with, but we will eventually. And so, yeah. And then if anybody ever wants, you know, no, I'll leave it at that.
Got it. Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
This is super fun. I'm so glad we did it, and keep doing it.